January 1945. A bitter cold sweeps through the camp. The air, thick with frost, bites at the skin as the women huddle together, their faces pale, eyes hollow with exhaustion. In the makeshift barracks, the low murmur of voices rises, but today, there is something different in the air. Something that hasn't been felt in months: hope. The sound of boots crunching through the snow is heard in the distance, and then a single truck comes into view. Soldiers, their faces hard and weary, unload bundles of blankets. But these are no ordinary blankets. The women's eyes narrow, puzzled at first. As the bundles are unwrapped, the colors become clear: bright red, white, and blue. The American flag, embroidered on each blanket, the stars and stripes. It is more than just fabric. It is a symbol of freedom, a connection to the outside world they have not known for years. The women stand frozen, their hearts racing. For a moment, they cannot comprehend what is before them. Then the tears begin to fall. These blankets, soft, vivid, and adorned with the emblem of a country they had never seen, are the first sign of life beyond the barbed wire. In that instant, the women know they are not forgotten. They are not alone. For a brief moment, the weight of their captivity lifts, replaced by a fleeting taste of freedom. The history of female prisoners of war during World War II is a stark reminder of the brutal realities faced by civilians caught in the conflict. As the war raged across Europe, Asia, and the Pacific, women were swept into the chaos in ways that few had anticipated. They were not only nurses, volunteers, and factory workers, but also victims of the enemy's cruelty when captured. In the early years of the war, the treatment of female POWs was often inconsistent, largely dependent on the nation holding them. Some countries adhered to the Geneva Conventions, which were designed to provide basic protections to POWs, while others ignored international laws altogether. The United States, for instance, had a policy of treating captured enemy soldiers with respect. But when it came to female prisoners, the American approach was less defined. Meanwhile, Axis powers, especially the Japanese and Germans, displayed varying levels of brutality toward female captives. In the Pacific theater, Japanese forces notoriously mistreated female POWs, especially those who had been captured after the fall of Singapore, the Philippines, and other occupied territories. Women were often forced into slave labor, endured physical and psychological abuse, and lived in unspeakably harsh conditions. Similarly, in Europe, thousands of Soviet, British, and French women were taken prisoner by Nazi Germany. They were kept in internment camps, subjected to forced labor, and faced the constant threat of violence and death. The treatment of these women was not always recorded in the history books, but as the war unfolded, their suffering became a painful but crucial part of the broader narrative. Their lives were marked by despair and uncertainty, but they also shared an enduring resilience. It was only in the final years of the war that the Allied forces, led by the United States, began to focus on their treatment and, more importantly, their eventual rescue. The story of the blankets embroidered with the American flag is intertwined with this narrative of survival. It was in January 1945, in the dying months of the war, that American forces, having secured a foothold in Europe, began to push deeper into German-occupied territories. The battlefronts were slowly shifting, and the Allies were preparing for a final assault on the Third Reich. In the midst of this chaos, the United States government was working behind the scenes to offer some form of aid to those who had suffered the most: the women trapped in enemy POW camps. By the winter of 1944, the tide of war had turned decisively in favor of the Allies. The D-Day invasion in June had marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, and by January 1945, Allied forces were pressing hard on all fronts. The liberation of POW camps had become a priority, but the women held in these camps were still suffering in unimaginable conditions. The American military, led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower and the combined forces of the British and Canadian armies, began planning the final offensive across Western Europe. As they advanced, American intelligence reports began to reveal the true scope of the captivity faced by women in these camps. Though most Allied efforts focused on liberating men from German and Japanese prisons, the situation of female POWs remained just as dire. Many were held in isolated camps scattered across Europe, often in small, overcrowded barracks. In addition to being forced into labor, these women faced illness, malnutrition, and neglect. Conditions were made worse by the harsh European winter. Clothing was scarce, and many of the women had nothing more than rags to protect them from the cold. Basic hygiene and medical care were non-existent, and the psychological toll was immense. It was against this backdrop that a humanitarian gesture, one that would mark a turning point in the lives of these women, was set in motion. The American military, recognizing the need to boost morale and show compassion to those who had suffered the most, made the decision to send something symbolic, something personal. It was not simply a blanket. It was a sign of their humanity, a reminder that there was a world beyond the confines of the prison camp, a world that cared about their suffering. The embroidered American flags were a powerful symbol of that hope. The decision to send these blankets was both a tactical and psychological maneuver. For the American military, it was a way to reassure the prisoners that they had not been forgotten, and that the war was nearing its conclusion. The flags on the blankets symbolized freedom, an affirmation that the women would soon be liberated, that their suffering was about to end. For the women, these simple blankets, stitched with the stars and stripes of America, became a symbol of survival, strength, and the promise of a better future. The symbolism of the flag carried weight beyond words. It represented a connection to the outside world, a world where their struggle mattered. As American forces closed in on the German heartland, the blankets were delivered to the camps. The timing was no coincidence. It was meant to be a beacon of hope just as the women's spirits had reached their lowest. The stars and stripes now embroidered on their blankets would serve as a constant reminder of the sacrifices being made to free them. The symbolic power of these American flags was not lost on the prisoners. In fact, it may have been the most important gift many of them would receive during their captivity. For the female prisoners of war, each day in captivity was an endurance test, a battle against despair. The psychological toll was immense. They had been taken from their homes, their families, and their countries, thrown into a world of deprivation, fear, and hopelessness. Many had been separated from their loved ones, and most had no knowledge of their fate. The uncertainty gnawed at them, amplifying the already unbearable conditions of captivity. In the cold, overcrowded barracks, they lived in a constant state of hunger and exhaustion. The daily grind of forced labor, inadequate clothing, and exposure to the harsh elements was punishing. For these women, hope was a luxury that had long been out of reach. They had learned to survive in ways that were unimaginable to most, enduring unimaginable hardships without ever knowing when their suffering might end. Each day, the line between survival and despair grew thinner, and each flicker of hope felt fleeting. Yet amid this, there was an incredible resilience. The arrival of the blankets embroidered with American flags represented something that could not be measured by mere fabric. It was a tangible connection to the world they had been severed from. The flags were a spark in the darkness, igniting memories of home and a sense of dignity that had been stripped from them over time. The emotional weight of receiving these blankets was profound. For many women, the sight of the flag was an emotional outpouring, tears of joy, of relief, and of disbelief. It was a reminder that they were seen, they were valued, and they would be liberated. In that moment, their fight for survival was no longer a solitary one. It had become a collective struggle, a beacon of hope sent from afar. The tactical significance of the camps holding female POWs was not just about their immediate liberation. It was tied to a broader military and political context. Women held as POWs were often used as bargaining chips in negotiations, though they were also strategically placed in camps to keep them far from the battlefield. In many cases, their treatment was tied to the power dynamics of the war. Captors treated female prisoners as symbols of their military power over entire nations, yet their existence in these camps was often overlooked in strategic military planning. The Allies, however, understood that the treatment of POWs, both male and female, was vital to the broader moral battle. The knowledge that women were being held in such dire conditions galvanized American and British efforts to address this issue as soon as the Allied forces gained ground. The planning and logistics behind the effort to send these symbolic gifts, American embroidered blankets were as much a part of the war effort as any tactical maneuver. On the front lines, once the American forces reached the European mainland, military planners began to gather intelligence on the locations of the POW camps, both for the purpose of liberating the prisoners and for the broader moral impact. Sending the blankets was not only a direct response to the suffering of these women, but also a symbolic message to the enemy. The Allies were not only fighting for territory, but for the lives and dignity of every individual under oppression. The decision to send blankets embroidered with the American flag was not an impulse. It was the result of careful deliberation and an understanding of the importance of morale. Leadership, both military and civilian, had long recognized the vital role that symbols and small acts of kindness could play in the broader context of war. For the United States, this gesture was led by a recognition that the war's final stages were not only about military victories, but about restoring humanity in a world so torn by conflict. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, had long placed emphasis on the welfare of prisoners of war. Even as the military focused on achieving tactical success, Eisenhower understood the psychological toll the war took on those caught in the crossfire, both soldiers and civilians. In December 1944, the Allies had begun liberating the first concentration camps and POW camps in Europe. Eisenhower, deeply moved by the suffering he witnessed, took swift action to address the needs of the liberated individuals. The decision to send blankets with American flags was a direct response to the suffering of women POWs and was emblematic of a broader strategy to restore hope and dignity. The U.S. government, through its military leadership, wanted to make it clear that these women were not forgotten and that their sacrifices were recognized. The gesture was not just about material aid, it was a statement of intent. It reinforced the Allies' moral stance against the Axis powers. For the women in the camps, receiving the blankets embroidered with the stars and stripes was symbolic of the leadership's commitment to their freedom and future. The American flag was more than just a national symbol. It was a declaration that liberty, justice, and respect for life would ultimately prevail. While the American military worked tirelessly to improve the lives of prisoners of war, the Axis powers, particularly Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, exhibited a stark contrast in their treatment of captives. Under the Nazi regime, the treatment of female POWs was marked by cruelty, neglect, and dehumanization. In the camps, women were often forced into slave labor, subjected to physical abuse, and given little more than the bare minimum to survive. The Geneva Conventions, which set standards for the humane treatment of POWs, were flagrantly violated by Nazi Germany, and the treatment of Soviet and Allied female prisoners was often horrific. In the Pacific, the Japanese military's mistreatment of prisoners was equally brutal. Many women were subjected to forced labor in factories and military installations, where they faced grueling hours, poor food, and severe punishments for minor infractions. As the war wore on, the Japanese became less concerned about maintaining even a facade of decent treatment, and the female POWs held in the Pacific Theater faced some of the worst conditions of the entire war. The German and Japanese POW camps lacked the humanity that was evident in the Allied treatment of prisoners. Where the Allies saw individuals, the Axis powers often saw nothing more than subjugated subjects. This inhumane attitude toward women POWs only deepened the symbolism of the gesture that came from the American military in 1945. The delivery of the American flag-embroidered blankets was an act of compassion in sharp contrast to the cruelty these women had experienced at the hands of their captors. The winter of 1945 was a time of great change. The Allied forces, having successfully landed in Normandy and steadily advanced across Europe, were closing in on the heart of Nazi Germany. The war was nearly over, but the suffering of the prisoners, especially those held in remote camps across Europe, was far from finished. As the Allies pushed further eastward, their intelligence teams gathered vital information about the conditions inside these camps. Among the most pressing priorities were the female POWs. These women had endured unimaginable hardships, and their liberation was fast becoming a moral imperative for the Allies. By January 1945, the war's end was in sight, but the Nazis were determined to hold on. The female POWs held in the camps remained under Nazi control, but there were whispers of the coming liberation. The Allied military command was keenly aware of the need to bolster the morale of these prisoners before their liberation. The situation was fragile. Starvation, disease, and physical abuse had reduced the women to the brink of despair. They had little energy left to continue their fight for survival, but the promise of freedom, though distant, was becoming tangible. Then, something small, but enormously symbolic happened. Orders came down from high command to begin the process of delivering supplies, food, clothing, and most notably blankets, embroidered with the American flag. This mission was a coordinated effort, requiring the support of both American and British military personnel. These blankets were to be distributed to female prisoners in several camps, with the knowledge that their arrival would coincide with the rapid advance of the Allied forces. It was a calculated move, one designed to give the women a glimpse of the freedom that was just beyond the horizon. On the day the blankets were delivered, the trucks arrived with little fanfare. The soldiers who carried them had seen enough of the horrors of war to know the importance of this gesture. There was a weight to the moment that went beyond the logistics of the delivery. These blankets were not merely physical objects, they were laden with hope, promise, and the ultimate symbol of liberation. When the blankets were unwrapped, the women prisoners stood frozen. The sight of the American flag, so vibrant, so familiar, was unlike anything they had seen for years. It was more than just a piece of fabric. It was the emblem of the world that was soon to be theirs again. For many of them, it was the first time in years that they had seen any sign of the outside world. The moment the blankets were handed out, something stirred in the hearts of the women. It was the realization that they were no longer forgotten, no longer abandoned in the dark corners of the enemy's world. Their long suffering was about to end. The reaction was immediate. Women who had been numb from the harshness of their captivity wept openly. Tears of joy, of disbelief, flowed freely as they wrapped themselves in the warmth of the blankets. For those who had been in captivity the longest, the act of receiving the flag-embroidered blankets was as close to redemption as they could imagine. It wasn't just the warmth of the fabric that moved them, but the warmth of the thought behind it, the knowledge that the American forces had not forgotten them and that they would soon be free. The emotional weight of the blankets was profound. The simple act of receiving such a powerful symbol, embroidered with the American flag, seemed to carry an unspoken promise, a promise that the war was coming to an end, and that freedom was at last within their grasp. For the women, these blankets were more than a material gift. They were a lifeline, a tangible connection to the outside world. In that frozen moment, the fabric seemed to embody everything they had lost, their homes, their families, and the lives they had known before the war. Yet it also carried with it the hope of everything they stood to regain. The delivery of these blankets, as small as it may seem in the grand sweep of history, was a turning point. It was the moment when the despair that had hung over the women in those camps began to lift. It was the first light of the new day, warm, soft, and tinged with the promise of liberation. For those who had languished in the most oppressive and isolated conditions, this moment was transformative. It was the symbolic victory of the individual over the brutal machinery of war, a moment where something human, something kind, reached across the barbed wire and the bleakness of captivity. The very presence of the American flag, stitched onto these blankets, was a reminder of the Allies' commitment to human dignity. The Nazis, who had treated their captives with cruelty and indifference, could do nothing to take away the symbolic power of those stars and stripes. The women could hold on to this symbol of hope, their connection to a world that was fighting for their freedom, a world that would soon come to their rescue. Within weeks of the blanket distribution, the Allied forces made significant strides across Europe. The liberation of POW camps accelerated as American, British, and Soviet forces converged on the heart of Nazi territory. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide, signaling the inevitable collapse of the Third Reich. German forces began to surrender in large numbers, and with that came the final push to free the women held in the concentration and internment camps. When the prisoners were finally liberated, their journey was far from over. They faced the aftermath of years of suffering, but they were free. And as they left behind the camps that had held them captive for so long, many of them carried those blankets with them, not as mere possessions, but as sacred symbols of survival, hope, and the strength they had found in the face of unspeakable horrors. The liberation of female prisoners of war in 1945 marked the end of one of the most harrowing chapters in human history. Yet as they stepped out of the confines of their captors' brutality, The women faced a new battle, one of recovery, reintegration, and the daunting challenge of rebuilding their shattered lives. For many, the physical toll of their years in captivity was immediately apparent. The deprivation of food, the grueling labor, and the constant threat of violence had left their bodies frail and scarred. Malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion had reduced the once strong women to mere shadows of their former selves. Many had lost weight, their once vibrant faces drawn with the marks of prolonged suffering. It would take time, months, even years, for these women to regain their health and strength. Hospitals and rehabilitation centers became temporary homes for many, as medical teams worked tirelessly to treat the women for injuries, illnesses, and psychological trauma. The blankets, which had provided such a profound emotional relief, were a small but important part of the healing process. They were not just physical warmth. They symbolized survival, resilience, and the idea that the women were worthy of dignity, no matter how long they had been oppressed. For some, the blankets became cherished possessions that accompanied them as they were repatriated to their home countries. They were reminders of the compassion that had helped them endure the darkest days of their captivity. However, the physical recovery was only part of the journey. The psychological wounds left by years of abuse were deep, and for many women the scars would remain long after their bodies had healed. The trauma of their imprisonment was not easily erased. Some struggled with the horror of what they had seen and endured, while others faced the haunting reality of losing loved ones, who had either been killed in battle or left behind when they were captured. Yet, despite the overwhelming obstacles, there was a sense of solidarity among the women. Many of them found strength in each other, forming lifelong bonds that transcended the trauma they had shared. Their collective resilience became a testament to the power of the human spirit. The stories of their suffering and survival began to trickle out, reaching the public as the world slowly learned of the atrocities committed by the Axis powers. The American and British governments, recognizing the depth of the psychological toll on female POWs, also began to offer additional support. Special programs were established to assist in their reintegration, providing financial aid, counseling, and assistance with finding jobs and housing. However, for many, the long road to recovery was slow and painful. The aftermath of war was not simply about returning to normal life. It was about finding a new sense of purpose in a world forever changed by the horrors of conflict. For the women who had received the American flag embroidered blankets, the aftermath also meant grappling with the profound symbolism of that moment. The blankets had been a lifeline, but now they were cherished mementos of a time when the possibility of freedom, dignity, and hope had seemed like a distant dream. They were reminders of both the darkness of their captivity and the light of their liberation. The aftermath of the liberation extended far beyond the immediate physical and psychological recovery of the women. As they returned to their home countries, many were confronted with the challenge of reintegrating into societies that had been irrevocably changed by the war. The world they left behind when they were captured was not the same one they returned to. Their families had endured their own hardships, and in some cases loved ones had been lost forever in the chaos of wartime. For many of the women, returning home felt like entering a world that had moved on without them. The American government, having sent the blankets as a symbol of hope, continued to play a role in supporting these women as they returned to civilian life. The government recognized the toll the war had taken, not just on soldiers but on civilians, and especially on women who had been captured. The U.S. military worked with aid organizations to help female POWs reintegrate into society, offering medical care, financial assistance, and psychological support. However, the social stigma attached to being a prisoner of war was not easily erased. The women who had suffered in captivity often faced difficulties in regaining their pre-war lives, both socially and economically. The scars they carried, whether visible or invisible, marked them in ways that would shape their futures. For those who had been liberated in Europe, the recovery was no less complex. Many of these women, especially those from the Soviet Union or other occupied countries, had endured some of the harshest conditions. The Soviet government in particular was slow to address the needs of returning female POWs. However, in the years following the war, women who had been captured by the Nazis began to speak out about their experiences, contributing to a growing awareness of the brutal treatment they had suffered. Their stories, much like the emotional weight carried by the American flag embroidered blankets, began to shed light on the untold suffering of women in wartime. In the years that followed, the legacy of these women was slowly recognized. International efforts to improve the treatment of female POWs in subsequent conflicts were informed by the lessons learned from World War II. The Red Cross and other humanitarian organizations began pushing for better protections for female prisoners, understanding that women faced unique challenges in captivity, challenges that required targeted aid and support. The blanket itself became a symbol that transcended the individual women who received it. For some, it remained a cherished item passed down through generations, a family heirloom that carried the story of survival and resilience. It served as a reminder not just of the American military's gesture of goodwill, but of the courage and fortitude of the women who had endured so much. The blankets, once an object of despair and struggle, became beacons of hope and triumph. They symbolized the power of small acts of kindness in times of overwhelming adversity, and the enduring belief that humanity, even in its darkest moments, could offer compassion and dignity. As the years passed, and the world continued to heal from the scars of war, the memory of these women and their blankets lived on. Their stories, shared with future generations, served as a reminder of the importance of remembering the suffering of those caught in the crossfire of conflict and the enduring strength of the human spirit. The delivery of the American flag-embroidered blankets to female POWs in 1945, though a small gesture in the grand sweep of history, holds profound significance. It is a story of humanity's resilience in the face of cruelty, of the power of symbols to transcend suffering, and of how even the darkest times can bring forth moments of hope and compassion. The blankets represented more than warmth. They were a message, a beacon of freedom sent across the lines of captivity. To the women who received them, these flags embodied the promise of liberation, a reminder that the world beyond the barbed wire still cared about their suffering. In the context of a war that had stripped them of their dignity and their lives, those embroidered stars and stripes were a reminder of everything they had once known, a symbol of home, of safety, and of the hope for a future beyond the walls that had held them prisoner for so long. In the years that followed the war, as the world rebuilt itself and attempted to heal, the legacy of these women endured. Their stories, shared with the world, became a testament to the strength of the human spirit. It was not just the physical strength to endure the hardships of war, but the emotional strength to hold on to hope, even when that hope seemed far out of reach. It is in their resilience that we find the true meaning of survival, not merely existing in the face of despair, but finding ways to reclaim the humanity that war so often tries to strip away. The American flag-embroidered blankets became part of the enduring memory of World War II, a symbol of compassion amid brutality, of light amidst darkness. For those women, it was more than a simple piece of fabric. It was a testament to their survival, their courage, and the deep, unbreakable link between hope and humanity. They had been captured, beaten, and broken by war, but they had not been forgotten. In the end, it was these small gestures of kindness that helped them reclaim their lives, and in doing so, gave them a sense of agency over their own futures once more. The story of these women, and the blankets they received, remains a powerful reminder of the enduring need for compassion in the face of conflict. It calls us to remember that war is not only fought on battlefields with guns and tanks, it is also fought in the hearts of those who refuse to lose hope, even when faced with unimaginable suffering. The women who received the blankets were not just survivors of a war. They were symbols of strength, resilience, and the undying human spirit.